Pranda Akoiso, good afternoon and welcome. And thank you for all of you for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Victoria Ford. I'm Chair of Digital Leaders here in Wales. I'm also Director at Prago, we're a Swansea-based digital transformation and service design company. I'm going to be facilitating this afternoon's sessions. So before we kick off the conversation, let me just give you a little bit more on the format and how things are going to be working. So this webinar is part of Digital Leaders in Wales. So there's a whole series of events that are happening today and for the rest of the week. We've got this one this afternoon, then on Friday afternoon we've got the second event that we're running for Digital Leaders in Wales around the role of innovation for the economy in Wales. So if you can join us for that one as well, that would be great. You can find the details of that and all of the others on the Digital Leaders website if you're interested in joining them. So what we're going to be doing today is having an informal conversation, or at least that's why I've sold it to our speakers today. So what we'll do in a moment is we'll be asking them to just give us a bit of an introduction. I've then got a few questions that I'm going to ask of the panel, but actually what we really want is for you to be able to ask questions and get involved in the conversation as well. So the more we can make it interactive, the better. You can put your hand up, you can add things into the chat, whichever way you want to, and we'll try and pull people into the conversations as well. My colleague Chris is on the call with me. He'll be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you have any technical issues or questions, please feel free to pop those into that as well. We are recording the session today, so it can be used on the Digital Leaders site. So hopefully that's okay for everybody. And the usual things, please can you keep yourselves on mute unless you're asking a question. Feel free to have your cameras on or off, whichever suits you best. We're easy with that as well. So as I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panel members just to introduce themselves with a short introduction. I'll kick off with a couple of questions. Anyone can join in then. If you've got questions to ask, please do so. So with that, I think, Jessica, are you happy to kick us off with the introductions, please?
Thank you very much, Victoria. Really, really good to be here. My name's Jessica Leigh Jones. I suppose in my day job, I am co-founder and chief executive of a company called Youngo Solutions. So Youngo is a tech startup, creative technology startup operating in the education and careers space. But I'm also the chair of the Centre for Digital Public Services, which is probably why I've been invited today. And for those of you who are not aware, CDPS was set up last year in 2020 to support the delivery of better public services in Wales. So we'll work alongside the Chief Digital Officers, CDOs in Welsh Government, Health and local government, and we are responsible for delivering the digital strategy for Wales.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Kelly, can we go to you, please?
Yep, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. So I'm Kellie Beirne. I'm Director of Cardiff Capital Region. I'm also a board member of Research England, which is part of UK Research and Innovation. And I suppose my interest, Victoria, is not just in innovation in public services, but innovation by and for public services. So I'm really looking forward to talking through some of the wider connotations around that description when we get into the discussion in a few minutes' time. Thanks for inviting me.
Lovely, thank you very much. Nial, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Of course, morning or afternoon, or sorry, afternoon, we've crossed 12. I'm Nial Grimes, I'm Head of Strategy and Innovation with Welsh Water. So we're not a public sector organisation, but of course we have that history of being publicly owned. So I'm really looking forward to getting involved in the conversation this afternoon. And you know, Welsh Water as a kind of an area for innovation is really interesting because we're building on networks at times that are kind of Victorian and kind of that colliding with, if you like, with kind of digital innovation. It makes for an interesting time. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Thanks, Nial. And as like you say, it's very similar to public sector. I'm quite interested in some of the learnings from Welsh Water across the public sector. So it'd be good to have those conversations as well. Thank you. Katie, could we go to you, please?
Hi there, my name is Katie Harris. I am a service designer, social innovator type that's been working in this space for 14 years now, so it's quite a long time. But yeah, my interests are mainly in service design and digital transformation. My claim to fame really is that I am the first ever designer to be embedded into a local authority back in 2008. Yeah, but I've worked across local and central government in England, but have recently made the move to Cardiff. I'm half Welsh, Hiraeth is real. I am here, very excited to learn more in the last couple of months about what's been going on. Definitely interested in hearing more about what everyone's got to say today.
And croeso I Gymru. Nice to have you here, Katie. Thank you. And finally, pass over to Rob, please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rob. I'm the head of Nesta Cymru. So Nesta is the UK's innovation agency for social good. We design, test and scale new solutions to some of society's biggest problems, hopefully changing millions of lives for the better. We've recently established a team in Wales, the Nesta Cymru teams. There's about 12 of us. And until fairly recently, I was also the co-lead of Lab, which is a public service innovation lab for Wales, where we ran lots of programs that supported practical innovation in and for public services, very much in the vein that Kellie described earlier on, as well as undertaking research into how and why innovation happens in public services as well. So it's great to be here today.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to all of you. We've chosen the subject of building a culture of innovation. And for me, this is more important than the process, really. It's a bit like anything to do with digital transformation. It's about the people, it's about the culture and how you create the right environment for innovation to happen, and particularly, as you say, in the public sector, what does that actually mean for us? So I suppose I'll just kick off a question to you, Jessica, if I may, around the priorities for the Centre for Digital Public Services. Like you said, it's a relatively new organisation, been around a year or so now. But when it comes to building that culture of innovation in the public sector, what is the sort of priorities for CDPS, and what, if any, barriers do you see from that work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Victoria, and I think there's a few parts to that. So maybe if I start with what we've done so far, I know we're relatively new, but there's a lot to shout about already. So we've achieved a huge amount in the last 12 months, and particularly, I suppose, our focus has been on the creation of shared standards for public services, building communities, sharing knowledge. We've also looked at skills and capability for digital roles, and also testing this concept. Many of you may even have been involved, but testing this concept of digital squads. So this idea of multidisciplinary teams who work alongside organisations to deliver better public services. And we're very much continuing to develop these themes, but also now looking at sort of baselining digital public services in Wales through the landscape review, which again, you may have heard of. So we're really looking at what are the big ticket items, where should we be prioritising our work, because there is so much to be done, and we've all got a sort of part to play in that. So I think we really need to be able to support the delivery of public services in Wales and give people the skills and the knowledge, not just to do the jobs as they've always done them, but actually to adapt and improve the way that they deliver public services. Now, in terms, I suppose, of building that culture of innovation, I think when we talk about digital, we think about technology, and it really isn't that. And when we think about innovation, we think of, expense, right? We think of cost and big shiny new things. And again, it isn't really that. But these concepts of digital and innovation are really changing the way in which we work. So for us, I think it's about being more agile, about putting users at the center of everything we do, starting small and iterating, not waiting for that kind of big bang approach that may happen in 3 years or may never happen at all, as has previously been the case. And again, really sort of looking at the user through all of that. So it is a big cultural shift, I think, which is what we're going to be talking about today for most organizations, not just the public sector either. And so the barriers really, change is difficult. Whatever kind of change, whatever kind of transformation you do in digital or otherwise, it's complicated. And I think the way that CDPS can support with that is to develop this set of digital standards, which mean that we're focused on the needs of those users, but also to support the way that we create culture and the way that we do things differently. So thinking about multidisciplinary teams, it's quite revolutionary for a lot of organizations, bringing people's skills together, not working in silos, being more open, empowering teams to take risks and to iterate. I think, if I look at the education sector, which is obviously a lot of my sort of background, we sort of go on this conveyor belt where success is the only way, right? We can't be seen to fail. We've got to get good grades at GCSE to get onto A levels, and we've got to get good grades there to go to university. And eventually people will fail. And we need to embrace that, because failure is a really positive thing. That's how we learn the quickest. So I think helping people to understand that failure is part of the process and it's absolutely okay. And the quicker we do it and learn from it, the better. So hopefully that's a summary to start with.
Thank you. And you sort of mentioned that obviously it's not just about the public sector. Maybe I can ask Kellie to come in here, actually, Kellie, because with the Cardiff City region work that you're doing, that's about sort of fostering that innovation across more than just the public services in the region. It's around businesses, it's about the foundational economy piece. So what do you think the support is that's actually needed to think about doing these things differently?
I think a lot of it, Victoria, is the soft cultural stuff, isn't it? And as Jess has said, there's a place for standards and multidisciplinary teams and different ways of working. But I think if we don't embed some principles to support that process in a soft way, whether it's public or private sector, it's not going to get embedded. So, you know, having grown up in public services, you hear all these definitions of culture, don't you? It's what we grow people in, you know, culture's about creating conditions, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It may be all of those things, but fundamentally it's giving people space and permission to have a go. You know, it's not fostering failure in a reckless way, but it's saying, look, we've got to have different risk thresholds and tolerances, because the biggest risk of all is failure by omission, is the risk of standing still. So it's mindset stuff. It's encouraging curiosity. It's okay to challenge, you know, things like reverse mentoring are great for that. But I think in my experience, the most fundamental question of all is, does someone have your back? Because if you know someone has got your back, then you can feel empowered to do anything.
Links to these things, apologies.
Don't worry. So yeah, I think, you know, that there's yeah, that's fine. Well, it's International Day today, so maybe that was a timely intervention. So I think for me, yeah, it's about embedding some of those soft things. So there's innovation within public services, but I also think, as I said at the beginning, there's this innovation by public services and how we create the right conditions out with for success in other sectors, such as the private sector. So I think, you know, for me, it's confronting issues of perception. You know, public services are bloated, they're risk averse, they're compliance based, they do the same old things they've been doing for the last 25 years. And I don't think that's right. You know, I think in COVID we saw huge innovation across public services. I think there's big questions about how we sustain the legacy of that, which are really, really important. But this interface with the private sector, does the public sector crowd out the private sector, or does it crowd in the private sector? And I think there are probably some really interesting perspectives to bring to bear on that. And I'll talk about that later on, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely, that would be cool. I think that whole sitting alongside each other, especially in a country like Wales, you know, we're relatively small, you know, so, you know, we're kind of big enough to make a difference, small enough to really make sure that happens in a way that works across sectors. I think I can, maybe I'll bring Nial in here, because actually we talked about Welsh Water, but I worked in Welsh Water, and I was some of the things that really amazed me when I went into there for an organisation like yourself is the diversity of professions that you have. It's almost like an ecosystem of public, private sector all happening in one space. So, you know, you've got scientists working in labs, then you've got people digging roads, and you've got people doing technology. So how do you look across all of those diverse professions and bring people together to think collaboratively about how you innovate? Because some of that reflects back on how we work across sectors.
Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of common themes, and so picking up on some of the things that have been said already, but where we've seen the best results is really where we bring all of those people together to solve the problem together. And so we've called them hackathons. They're not really hackathons in the true sense of people kind of getting in a room and doing lots of coding. They're more kind of design thinking type events, but getting the guy who operates by the side of the road to sit in the same group of people solving the problems again, that multidisciplinary team, and coming out with a solution that both hits the numbers, is feasible technically, and you have a kind of an MVP that you're going to go after, is really, really powerful. And I think the first event, almost criminally, we didn't bring in as many of the frontline people as we should have done. But the real magic came out of having those frontline people in the groups, because there was quite a disconnect at times between what people back in the office thought was the problem and actually how that was experienced out on the front line. And so we made a conscious attempt as we did those moving forward to make sure that we we really kept those frontline people in there because they were a great leveler of the types of solutions that you came out with. And whilst the sort of the first few hackathons we did were kind of quite big events, it's taking that same type of approach and using it in kind of workshops, in kind of different smaller settings, which has become a bit harder owing to COVID, because I think these things really work best when you sort of breathe in the same air. But yeah, it is something we've really tried to continue, is bringing cross-section of people together, solving the problem together, and then going away and working out what's the smallest thing we can deliver that actually demonstrates that's going to solve our problem.
And that inclusivity bit there, bringing people into things and creating a culture where people feel they do have a voice, is a really important one, isn't it? Because whether you're in a small organisation or working across multiple, council areas in Wales or whatever, being able to bring people in is really important. And COVID has made that easier and harder in equal measures as we from that side of things. I wonder if I can bring Rob in a bit here, because Rob, your sort of work with Lab and Nesta, I think that bit around how we make a culture innovation an inclusive culture and what we can do to break down some of those barriers. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of important points to think about this. One is about fostering more of that collaboration and using that to make sure that, I think two things happen. One is that the right people participate in the process of innovation. And if we go back to the start of last year, Nesta undertook a bit of research, a bit of representative research around how innovation happens in Wales and who benefits from it. And I think it was fairly clear from that lots of people don't feel like they're able to participate in the process of innovation. They feel that it's a process that other people do, particularly those people who are more affluent or better connected, or things like that. So we do need to make sure that we're reaching out and we're bringing the right people into those collaborative spaces, whether that's employees from different bits of the organisation, whether that's people who use public services or are impacted by or benefit from public services. There's lots to do around that, definitely. I think the other thing is making sure that we're innovating with purpose and being really clear about why innovation is happening in public services. So to what end, and how is that purpose going to impact on lots of different people? So are the impacts of our innovation being felt equally across different groups of people, or are they being felt in ways that are intended by different groups of people? So making sure that our innovations don't do harm to some groups when they're doing benefit to others, I think is really important. So it's a really hard thing to get right. I think a lot of what we are going to talk about today is hard to do, and we should always acknowledge that. Like if it was easy, we wouldn't need this panel, and that's probably worth sticking on the wall right now. So I don't necessarily have lots of really good answers for people about this. There are lots of things that people can try, and I think that's a big part of this. We've got to kind of learn by doing, and failure has been mentioned, as it always is in innovation chats. It's failure with purpose as well that's important. So making sure that we're capturing what we learn and that we're capturing the right things. And I think we might talk a little bit later on about measurements around innovation as well. So yeah, I think generally speaking, innovation is never as inclusive as it needs to be, but hopefully we're becoming a lot more aware about kind of where we're not being as inclusive as we should be, both in terms of participation and in terms of impact as well.
Yeah, and so I'm going to ask Katie to come in a minute, because Katie's done quite a lot of work in that kind of social innovation, particularly with older people, and there's difficult to reach groups, that there are seldom heard voices, all of that. I know you've done some work around that, Katie, and I'd be quite interested in whether there's anything that you can cite as good examples of how this has worked or could work for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think just generally speaking, like the kind of funding that kind of backs a lot of this stuff is the reason why it gets the kind of spotlight. Like I've done 2 social startups around active aging, both funded by Nesta, thanks very much. Yeah, so basically I kind of feel, I mean, that's my only kind of, only issue I have with kind of the kind of social innovation scene is that there seems to be kind of like flavors of the month that kind of pop up, and then a lot of energy and money goes towards one thing. Obviously at the moment, like climate change is a big issue and everyone's talking about it, but I guess from my, the more I kind of go down and like think about just humanity in general, there's some pretty glaring issues that hardly ever get mentioned, or they're just kind of always things that, do you know what I mean? Like, for example, like, child abuse is a pretty big thing that kind of leads on to a variety of issues as you kind of grow older, but it never seems to be a hot topic ever. So I think that my question is kind of, especially when we're thinking about kind of Wales wanting to kind of tackle kind of big issues that are, with social innovation, is that, are we going down kind of deep enough and asking the right questions to the right people? Are we able actually to kind of, let alone kind of like reach out to the people that need to, their voice heard? Are we actually even asking the right questions at the time? So that's just a question.
And thanks, Katie. I come across to Kellie there, because I know a lot of your Challenge Fund work is around tackling some of those big societal problems. So interested, any thoughts you have in that space, Kellie?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it's the interface of the public and private, which is so interesting here. So working with Rob and the guys at Cardiff University and Nesta and many others, we've tried to sort of pioneer this mission-driven approach to tackling big societal problems that, if we get it right, could have big economic byproducts. So big fans of the work that Professor Mariana Mazzucato has done at UCL and her Institute of Public Purpose and Innovation. And what we've tried to say is, look, how can we solve some of these big economic and societal problems? What are the things that have been really killing us during killing the economy, I should say, during the COVID period? The future of high streets, food security, resilience, rapid enough decarbonisation, in particular of the public estate. And what are we going to do about them? And typically, I think what we do is we come up with a project, don't we? And we go out to tender with the usual suspects and we say, look, this is the outcome we want to achieve. The difference here is we're putting a problem out there. And we're saying, look, we have no idea how to really solve this problem. It's intractable. It's been around for too long. And by the public sector taking ownership of this and convening around that problem, opening up data sets, opening up insights and intelligence, it allows the private sector, startup businesses, somebody who may be innovating in their back bedroom, because this is about civic regard and innovation as well. It's about understanding how we can go through a process of research and development in the public sector, and to use tools like public procurement to really leverage the power of the public balance sheet, which in economic terms in South East Wales is worth about £3 billion. So we're at the very start of this process. We've got some really good challenges, a fantastic one around food security and resilience. How do we get all local authorities to move together towards a zero carbon fleet? Because if you think about how your waste gets collected, how Meals on Wheels are delivered, home to school transport is delivered, there's a massive opportunity there for decarbonisation. Some really good stuff with health boards around plastics, around better food supply chains into hospitals and into care settings. So significant potential, but it requires us to think in almost a back to front way. Don't think about the outcome, think about the challenge that together we're trying to respond to. And it's really using much more innovative procurement to procure innovation, which is a really, really different concept, but one I think there's loads of scope and opportunity around. I think allied to that, the piece of work that Rob is doing with us and with various different partners supported by WEFO is around building and embedding that innovation capacity within public services. So as well as focusing on how we can solve problems and how we bring the different collaborators together to solve problems, it's about that institutional investment that we need to make to embed innovation at the core of public services. If you think about how many people we employ to do finance in public services, are the people who are the innovators the same in number? And I think this is about sort of redressing that balance. And as I say, institutionalizing innovation at the heart of what we do, but developing the interface with the private sector, which is where I think the really creative stuff can happen.
Thank you, Kellie. I'm going to pause there a second in case anyone's got any questions for the panel. As I said, I can keep asking. I know they can keep discussing amongst themselves as well. But if you do have any questions, you can either drop them into the chat or put a hand up.
Victoria, could I come in here a second?
You can, yes.
Would that be okay? Thank you. I think Kellie's made some really, really pertinent points there. I just wanted to build on that a little bit from a slightly different perspective, I suppose, as well. So I think, you know, Wales has this kind of, particularly in the public sector and within government, anything kind of government funded, we've got this habit of being in pilot mode a lot of the time. So we do lots of pilots, we do pilots on everything, right? Apprenticeships is a big one that we've been involved in. And it's really, really great. And I think that devolution and regionalisation, you know, the city deals are creating really good opportunities to be agile and to get some of these new ideas and innovations off the ground. I think the risk that we have is that we don't properly connect these things up and we never get out of pilot mode. You know, we never properly sort of transfer this best practice. And I think that's something that, you know, we just need to be cognizant of, and we need to have more of these conversations together. Because I mean, I've learned so much in the last 5 minutes. I didn't even know Nesta Wales existed. I knew about Nesta, but I didn't know it was in Wales. So I think there are lots of opportunities to just connect things up. And there was one other thing that I wanted to mention, which sort of builds on that. So there are huge opportunities for the private sector to work with the public sector. And I agree with Kellie around the need for more innovative procurement and different ways of doing procurement. What I would say, though, procurement by its very nature kind of implies that, you know, government or public body has identified a need to purchase something, to procure something. And I think there are opportunities where, particularly post-COVID, you know, we've got so many startups, biggest number of new organizations created, I think, in history. We've got so many new innovations coming to the forefront, and it's really, really difficult for small private sector organizations and startups to create those relationships and to work with the public sector. And I think we've got to find ways of possibly being a little bit more opportunistic. So if, you know, if a public sector organization is planning on doing something, but then a small startup comes along and they've already done it in a different area, how can they work together to accelerate that, you know, for the sort of the needs and the benefit of their users, rather than doing it all themselves because they've got the funding to do it. So I think there's definitely some areas where, as kind of leaders in this space, we can work together to make that happen and to make that a bit more fluid.
So it's a really good point. I wonder whether any of the other panel members have had any experience of that working well, or whether it is a challenge that we need to start addressing more widely. Rob, maybe from an Nesta and a lab perspective, have you seen any of that?
I think the closest I've seen, so I mean, essentially what we're thinking about here is how do we just not reinvent everything ourselves because we haven't quite seen what's happened already a little bit. And that's about kind of knowing what's out there. It's about being connected to what's going on. It's about being able to kind of scan your horizons and think about the nature of your problem effectively before you start trying to tackle it. And we have seen a bit of that happen. I think the most effective version I've seen of that has been one of the projects we funded through Innovate to Save, which is a programme we ran with Welsh Government for about 3 years, that looked at how you can reduce, generate cashflow savings in public services whilst also improving services for people. And Flintshire Council had seen a model of fostering called Mockingbird, which is all about creating extended families around foster households. In a bid to reduce placement breakdown, but also improve the support that foster carers get, because you know, we are losing foster carers from public services to private providers at a rate of knots, because, you know, paying conditions are to a certain extent better. They saw this Mockingbird model and it had been used in England, and it came from the States, and they wanted to adapt it in, but it had never been delivered in a rural setting like Flintshire before. It had only ever been delivered in kind of urban settings. So, you know, they worked with the people who generated this model, and they tweaked it and they tested it through our process. And now it's been adopted and implemented in Flintshire and is reducing placement breakdowns, and therefore saving the council money because they're not having to go out to private providers. It's retaining and hopefully recruiting new foster carers, and generally it's making the service better as a result. So it can happen, but it requires, I guess, quite an interesting mindset within public services, which is, you know, how do I get a sense of what's out there? How do I know that I've scanned the market, for want of a better word, to see what solutions exist? You know, do I actually know the problem I'm trying to solve before I start, so I can go and look for the right things to adopt or adapt? And that's part of what we're teaching people through Infuse, which is the program that Kellie mentioned. a moment ago. So the first thing that people do when they come through that program is take part in the Adaptation Lab, which is all about problem framing and thinking about experimentation and research and development in ways that help people get to a better point of a solution, rather than just diving in with the idea that they cooked up in the shower that morning.
And I think there's a question that's come in actually that's totally puts that point across, about how you join people up, how you know what's out there. So somebody's asking here, saying that they're an edtech startup, but they'd love to work with schools. What's the best way to approach schools and government to get software into schools? Well, that's kind of what we're talking about here, is how do we ensure people know what's out there and have a route through with the ideas that are coming out that build more innovation into our systems. So I don't know that we have the answers, but I don't know if there's any thoughts on that.
I think we haven't solved the whole problem, but I think we've solved quite a lot of the start of the problem. We've got what we call the iLab, which is Welsh Water's, if you like, formal innovation process. And anybody from any public sector or a private sector organisation, large or small, can put forward an idea to iLab that can potentially get funded to do some work with us. And we've seen quite a lot of good ideas come through that mechanism. I think being a formally public sector organisation, when you start then to scale up that work to do something bigger, is where you then start to run into some of the challenges around procurement and things that we're absolutely rightly expected to do. But and so I think there's further for us to go in terms of how we kind of incubate and then how we scale the things. And I think through some of the frameworks we're hoping to put in place, certainly around technology, it will be more open to kind of smaller organisations too. Whereas historically we've had the big kind of system integrators in those types of contracts, which usually ends you up with a particular type of solution. But that front door, I don't see anything that couldn't really work. Having formerly myself worked in the public sector, certainly to at least allow small startups to be able to demonstrate the value of what they have got, because that then moves you up to another level of being able to position something that is going to be effective.
That bit about being effective, I think, Rob, you mentioned it before as well, about how we measure some of this. So while we talk about public sector being innovative, creating this culture of innovation, part of it is actually demonstrating value from that as well. So I don't know what work you've done on measurement. I know Kellie may have some thoughts as well from the Cardiff City region deal, but I think she's dropped off a moment.
No, I'm back. Sorry, I had an update issue, but I am back. Apologies about that.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to ask you about some of the stuff around where you've seen that this type of innovation has actually made a difference to people's lives, and how we can demonstrate some of that. So there's a bit about a more formal measurement, but actually it's like, where does it work well?
Rob, did you want to go first?
Yeah, so again, I'll kind of take this in two bits. There's the bit about impact. So what impact does innovation have? And we've got some great examples of that. The Flintshire example is a great one. There's another one through Innovate to Save, which was all about giving people greater power over and I've forgotten the word, control over how they spend personal payments that they receive. So greater independence. We've seen that improves health and well-being. We've got some good measurement around that. That's a Leonard Cheshire-led project. So, if we're innovating with purpose and we understand the impact that we want to have for people, then that bit's relatively easy to measure. You need the expertise to do it, but it can be done. I think what's more difficult to measure is kind of the process of innovation itself and how we do that really, really well. Fortunately, as often is the case, we can look to Scandinavia for a bit of this. So the Danish Public Innovation Agency, COI, have for the last 6 or 7 years now been running something called the Innovation Barometer. And it's a brilliant tool that allows you to measure public service innovation across your entire sector with some relatively simple surveying tools. It's a little bit clunky, but it does give a great overview of the types of innovation that are happening in different bits of public sector. And it's been worked up to the extent that it's very close to being an international standard for the measurement of public service and public sector innovation. They've managed to get that rolled out across all of the Nordic countries, most of Scandinavia, and there are another 20 countries that have come together to help write the handbook for how you actually do this as well, including us. So we went out to help with this at the back end of 2019 when we were still allowed to travel freely, which was a lovely reminiscent moment earlier on. So you can do it, it can be done. You can think about, why you want to innovate and to what purpose. And, that barometer, I think, is really good because it allows us to kind of think about how we inspire workplaces to increase the quality and efficiency of what they do through innovation by showing what other people do. So, highlighting the stories that come out of innovation. Stories are obviously important for culture. They underpin a lot of what a culture is. Making sure that our decision makers have really good knowledge foundation for developing the public sector as well. So decision makers need to see that innovation works and it's possible, and it's not as scary as it sounds. It's not just change for change's sake. It's about doing things better, and showing is always better than telling in these situations, I think. And they're also using it as a bit of a teaching resource as well. So we have some pretty good public service leadership courses here. I know the university run them. So anything that kind of adds content and I think real life case studies to these sorts of things is really important as well. So you can measure innovation, but you can't always say innovation this year is 100. You have to think about the purpose of your measurements and the reasons for doing it and things like that. Sorry, it's a bit of a ramble because I love what the guys in Scandinavia are doing, and I think more people need to know about it. But hopefully that's useful and interesting.
And if I can, Victoria, just add on to that, I think there is some outstanding practice in Scandinavian countries, and Jessica and I have looked at that before in making an argument for things like national innovation bodies, which, track this stuff because that's what they do. They're there to inspire purposeful innovation. But I suppose I want to speak up for some more traditional measures as well, because I completely get, as Rob is saying, this is about storytelling. It's about sentiment, it's about how people feel. All of that is really critical. But I think some of the more traditional measures as well, like, private sector leverage, is the public sector in innovating, initiating the capacity to crowd in private sector money? Is there something that's pointing to the public sector being able to identify the growth opportunities for the private sector? So I think some of the more traditional stuff with a different slant can be really useful, especially when it comes to the alignment of different sectors, and I suppose leveraging a much, much bigger impact, which is going to be needed if we're going to solve, how to age well, big issues that we have in the region, in particular around future mobility, decarbonisation, the onset of data, AI, food security. You're going to need that different type and scale of innovation across the public, private and civic societal sectors as well. So there's some really interesting stuff going on. I'm not just advocating we measure happiness, because as great as those things sound, if we're going to make really good economic arguments about innovation in, by and with public services, I think some of the measures that we use have to have legitimacy with economists and others. So I think it's just about getting that balance right, isn't it?
And I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Around, public sector organisations might go, well, innovation's great. It's a thing that needs to happen over there because we're too busy. We've got stuff to do. And making it goes back to that culture piece about how do we make it part of the way that the public sector thinks about its delivery and how it's resolving some of those really tricky problems. I just put a reminder, if anyone's got any questions, just to drop them in the chat. But Katie, maybe I'll have a look through the chat in a sec. Are there any thoughts there around, with all of those challenges that the public sector is facing, all of the opportunity that we heard here from Kellie and others, is there a starting point for an organisation who says, people might be listening to this now, well, my organisation doesn't do anything? Is there a starting point, or does it depend on the organisation or what's happening?
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing is to kind of, to your point about people saying, I can't innovate right now, I've got too much chaos happening. It's that's actually the best time to innovate in the weirdest way, because everything's up in the air anyway, right? And I think also there's this kind of human, maybe public sector mindset of we'll organise change. Change will start now, but life is changing every second. We've seen this with COVID. We have, and I think this is the thing. It's change is happening anyway. It's your choice whether you want to hold the reins on it or not. It's going to run amok if you don't. So. And I think when I've been thinking back on kind of the time in Silk and Kent County Council, the main thing was like this kind of getting the like real sincere buy-in from the kind of chief exec and the senior management team level, and letting that kind of filter down and making sure that everyone, like we've been discussing, like everyone has permission and kind of training at all levels for it to be possible. I think the kind of biggest thing that I've seen over the kind of 14 years is that you might get a chief exec that's super keen, but there might be a middle manager somewhere along the line that does not want change. And do you know what I mean? Is actually just scared of change. And I think that that's, I mean, it's sad in general. A lot of things I've seen get blocked, but then you also see a lot of good people give up because they're tired of trying so hard. And yeah, just back to the point about this kind of centralized kind of like, I don't know what you call it, department of innovation or something of that ilk, you know. The beauty, like you spoke about, the beauty of Wales is there's 22 councils, which is an absolute, I mean, it just makes my heart sing to think that that's actually a possibility of getting everyone in the same room. In England, it's like, I think there's 360. So, you know, there's like, we've just got such a lovely kind of opportunity here for there to be quite a lot of kind of collaboration and kind of shared mindsets right at the top and filtering all the way down. So you get that kind of real transparency and that kind of, do you mean the insights feeding up from the frontline staff all the way to policy making, I think is, you know, once you get that kind of loop going and the confidence, but it really is down to training primarily, but then permission. If there's no permission and there's no confidence in that, it's just not going to happen.
I suppose, Jessica, that's where the centre comes in again, around sort of leading the way in some of this, working in collaboration with some of the really good work that we're hearing about that's actually going on. And I wonder how many people are aware of what those opportunities are and what the role of the centre is to actually bring people into this space and get people talking and making some of this stuff happen wider than their own particular areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right, Victoria. And I'd urge anyone, you know, with these sorts of projects, including Tony, who wants to get his EdTech project into schools. By the way, I'll let you know when I work out how you do that, because I'm in a similar position at the moment. But yeah, I would urge anybody really to just come forward and have a conversation with us. You know, as I say, part of our offering is ensuring that those skills and capabilities are in place. So whether that's through providing training or even, you know, sort of culture workshops, looking at, you know, I'm a sort of firm believer that you shouldn't necessarily have an innovation department, but you should involve everyone in that kind of innovation process. But it's a case of making sure that you've got that buy-in from top down. And I think there's a piece in there around how you kind of create a culture that empowers people to take those risks and to, you know, sort of iterate and, you know, sort of engage in innovation. But it's also about looking at the next generation of leaders as well. You know, because certainly in my view, leadership has a time and a place. And I think we certainly need to look at how we develop that next generation of leaders to really sort of embed and emanate this culture throughout the public sector. But I mean, back to the sort of original point about, you know, how we can help. So we've worked with organisations on a range of projects in the 12 months that we've been in existence, from sort of the Access in Social Care Alpha, which has now moved into Beta, which we did with 3 local authorities. Through to projects with Natural Resources Wales on waste management, and also increasing reach of community investment with Sports Wales. So we are willing to work with everybody. And I suppose we are a good kind of organisation to come to help you to create those connections and to look at, you know, it's amazing when people come forward with ideas that often these ideas have been done elsewhere. And that doesn't mean that it's the end of the line for what you want to do, but it's a case of how can you leverage the lessons learned and how can you connect with those organisations and those individuals to take those forward. So yeah, please, the door is open. Come and have a conversation with us.
Thank you. And Kelly, going back to the Cardiff City Region deal, forgive me, I've got this wrong. I think it's 10 council areas. Is it 10 that you work across?
It is, yeah. I'm very lucky.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like Katie was saying, it's an amazing opportunity. Could you just tell us a bit more about what you've seen happen differently as a result of that, and where those opportunities are for seeing things working differently across council areas in Wales?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. And I think this is my point more about innovation by public services. So the Cardiff Capital Region is a collective of 10 local authorities working with 2 other layers of government, Welsh Government and UK Government. So there are complexities involved in working in that multi-level governance environment. But I think the Cardiff Capital Region's done it really well, because you've got 10 local authorities coming together with a different mindset. So we have a £1.3 billion city deal. Some of that goes across to deliver in the South East Wales Metro, but some of it sits in a wider investment fund. And what we've tried to do is to say, look, the role of the public sector isn't just to administer this fund and give out grants in this case. We're not here to be funders, we're here to be co-investors. We want to take risk for reward. We see our job as creating and stimulating new markets, convening around some of these big industrial and economic societal problems of the day. So, we've got, I suppose, a vested interest in this different type and scale of interaction across public and private sectors. So how do we prepare that environment? Well, we've said we won't give grants. We try to get a return on our investment. So we're living off the interest, not spending down the capital. In every investment we make, we have to maximise private sector leverage. So we're not funding alone, we're crowding in that wider investment. We will always co-invest with others. So our money goes in not to de-risk, but to open up possibilities. So sometimes if we have to go first and take a completely different level of risk, we will do that. Sometimes there'll be market failure, but sometimes there'll be a surplus the public sector wants to generate, because that's important to invest in building resilience and making sure you can recycle your surpluses for the future. And I think the fact that we run this open investment fund, we don't have set projects. We don't say, right, by year 10 we want to build that, and by year 15 we'll have done that. We never know what's going to come across the threshold. So that drives a different and a very mature business model, because the 10 leaders have to keep coming together to make decisions in the best interest of the region. And I think that's different. And to date, we've done about 15 different investments. We've got sub-funds in operation. But I think the principle is we're trying to use levers like responsible investing to work with businesses who want to be part of solutions, not creating problems. Businesses that care about fair work and sustainability. And we can condition that investment. We can recycle that investment. So rather than just seeing our city deal as a pot that we spend down, this pot has got to be forever, because it's got to keep creating the opportunities to build resilience from here on in. So I hope it's a good example of the public sector getting together to do things differently, because we have to be different if we're going to exist and prosper in this much more competitive world.
Absolutely. What do you think that means for, let's call it foundational economy, but what does that mean for businesses in Wales? So is this about opportunity for businesses to think differently about how they work in collaboration with public sector, or do we still see private sector as two separate entities working in different directions? Do we need to shift the way we think about it?
Yeah, I think we do, because I think we think about the tradable economy and the foundational economy as separate, and they're not. There's a huge interface between them, and the knowledge economy connects both those things, because we need digital and we need data and we need different forms of procurement and outlooks in those sectors. So I think, one of the big companies that we're working with through one of our clusters, that's a big, it's a big institution. It's North American owned, but it's got headquarters here in the region. And they keep 85% of their supply chain in the region, because every time they've got a big order on or a big project, they bring that supply chain in and they train them and they develop them and they invest in them. They engage about 50 schools every year in the region. Every time they have investors or visitors over, there's about 3,600 bed spaces they use in the Cardiff capital region every single year. So the impact that that company has, even though it's fairly traditional, is part of an industrial cluster on the foundational economy, is absolutely massive. So I think we have to look at these things in a much more connected way, because I think, again, that's where the real innovation happens.
Thank you. Maybe Niall, you could come in here thinking about Welsh Water, and particularly the size of Welsh Water as an organisation and the type of companies that you're working with. Is it a similar thing that you see happening across you as a company?
Yeah, there's always opportunity to work with Welsh Water. I think that's in honesty, that's the difference of seeing coming away from the public sector and from the public sector moving to what is the private sector effectively. And Welsh Water thrives working with with kind of smaller companies around the region, really, because so much, Welsh Water, purely by the land mass we own and our vision for 2050, we're responsible for a huge amount of Wales in terms of kind of lead-free Wales, around kind of climate change. There's so many kind of bigger issues that we're kind of grappling with, really, as a broader picture. And so, a lot of the innovation activity we need to be doing needs to be looking to some of those broader topics, and it starts to lead in some really interesting areas in terms of technology. Everybody sees a Welsh Water van around the place, but those vans predominantly diesel at the moment. We don't want that to be the case. Do we really need to be sending vans around the place? So there's lots and lots of opportunities. Purely the plants we use are kind of big energy consumers. We've gone into kind of CHP type activity, so we're a net contributor to the grid down in the Cardiff area. So there's massive opportunity for Welsh Water working with private sector to innovate in those areas around those bigger challenges that we've got.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. Still have to take any questions. I've got a quiet audience today, or they're busy listening to you all. But as we're finishing off, perhaps I could just sort of leave it by going around each of you to ask you, bringing it right back to where we started, really, about how do we build a culture of innovation in the public sector in Wales. It'd be quite nice to get a key thought from each of you. I always say that what's the one thing you do if you only had one thing you were allowed to do, but it might be that. But who'd like to start?
I don't mind going first if you want, Victoria. Yeah, I suppose the most powerful thing I think I've ever done, and it was something that's quite trite on reflection, Rob knows, something very simple called fail fast, fail forward cards. And it was this principle that you carry these little cards around with you, and you sort of ask yourself, you've got a great idea, is it going to have really damaging consequences if it goes wrong? Because don't forget, in local authorities, we deal with people's lives. Or is it going to lose, a whole load of money the organisation can't afford to lose? And if you answer no, you've got clearance to go ahead and implement your idea. And every year at your appraisals, you have to, I suppose, cash in your fail fast, fail forward cards. It shows, yes, you failed, but it shows you tried, which I think in overcoming some of the barriers and the cultural issues is perhaps the most important thing we can do to value and support people to innovate and have a go.
I love that. Thank you, Kellie. And like you say, it's a bit trite. They're not trite, are they? Those are the things that actually are quite easy to do from this is what you have to do, but actually to put those into place from a cultural perspective can make a massive difference. Thank you. Who'd like to give us a tip?
I'll come in if you like, Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think, for me, it's classic change management theory, really, but I think it's so relevant to public sector organisations and to local authorities, because these are big ships that you've got to turn, right? And as I say, we don't want to have that. I remember when I was in manufacturing and I was part of the team responsible for kind of digital transformation across the factories. And we were almost seen as being in an ivory tower, because we worked on this future focused stuff and nobody else did. And so I really think, for me, the one thing is about creating that guiding coalition. It's making sure that everybody in the organisation understands the need for change, what change looks like, what that future state is going to look like, and creating that support and empowering people across the organisation, not just within the ivory tower, to actually take part in that.
Yeah, having voices heard, isn't it? It's so important. Thank you.
I can chip in there. I mean, picking up on similar themes, it comes back to the point I made earlier about kind of collaborative working across the organisation. And I think we've done that in IT. The way we were set up as an IT team was relatively legacy until recently. We needed to be moving towards that position where we're working more as multidisciplinary teams, even within IT. And just you find when you go out and you ask people where they really want to get to, quite often it's exactly where you need people to get to. But there's, over time, you build up almost a kind of a stalemate of needing the change, but people being fearful of the change. And so just building on Jessica's point there, I think it doesn't need to be a big program of work at times to achieve these transformations. It's just the drip, drip, drip of where do we really need to get to, and getting people onto the same page in terms of that change.
Thank you. Yeah, and building that trust as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, trust, yeah.
Katie, Rob, who wants to go next?
Okay. Yeah, I just think just touching on what basically people have said before, I think there's definitely got to be a moment where the kind of theory and the practice kind of balance out a little bit, and it goes from kind of like these theoretical conversations to proofs in the pudding, and having again the permission and the kind of backing from financially or from kind of your organization in order to do that, I think. And also just the whole point of like making it fun, making it exciting. I know it sounds basic, but it's just, I feel like when we talk about this in our own kind of world, it's very technical and like heavy, but actually, like it is fun. I think it's fun anyway.
Brilliant. Thank you. Rob, can we'll leave the final words to you.
Okay, pressure. I think there are two questions that public services can ask more regularly that will help to build a better culture of innovation. I think the first is asking where we are in the cycle of innovation. So are we starting with a challenge that has no solutions? Do we know, have we got some ideas that need testing? Do we know the solution, but we need to scale it? Being a little bit smarter about kind of understanding where we are in that process is something that we need to get better at. And I think the second is being better able to articulate what your role is in that process, having understood where you are in that cycle. And this speaks a lot to what Kellie's talked about. Public services can take lots of different roles in the process of innovation. They can be idea generators, they can be funders, they can be collaborative partners with access to significant assets, whether that's data or land or any of those things. What are you bringing to the table and what is your role in making sure that this innovation or this innovative idea moves to the next level? I think if we ask those two questions on a more regular basis, we'll get much better at building this culture of innovation across the whole of the public sphere.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's a good place to end. And I think sometimes understanding what even we mean by innovation, it can be off-putting to people. It suddenly is this big thing that people don't understand. So starting with those kind of questions is a good place to be. Look, that just leaves me to say thank you very much to the five of you for joining us, for having this conversation, and to Chris as well for helping out in the background and getting rid of our Russian radio station at that point. And finally, a huge thank you to everyone who's joined this. Hopefully you found it engaging and informative. As I said before, please go onto the Digital Leaders Innovation Week website for the other events that are happening, including joining us for our second event on Friday at 12 o'clock, when we're looking at innovation for the economy in Wales. So thank you very much indeed, everyone. Diolch yn fawr.